It is dawn on Wednesday, the 19th of July, 1916, northwest of the village of Fromelles in northern France, 19 days into the Somme offensive on the Western Front. The village of Fromelles was captured nearly 2 years ago during the race to the sea, when the German advance across northwest Europe was halted by the British and French. The opposing armies had tried to outflank each other until their front lines reached Belgium's North Sea coast. Fromelles had remained in German hands ever since, nestled behind a long and well-entrenched front line, held in this sector by the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division, and further supported by strategically positioned units along Aubert Ridge to the northwest of the village. The Allied aim for the battle that is about to begin is to deceive German High Command into keeping their reserves in place rather than sending them south to reinforce their units on the Somme, where the mighty Allied offensive is taking place. Before today, British forces have launched 2 unsuccessful attacks in the area in front of Aubert Ridge. The first, only 2 months after German forces occupied the area, was intended to capture the ridge itself. Then in May 1916, more than a year after the first attempt, the British 8th Division sought to seize the German positions before the ridge. Some 11,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. After the battle, German soldiers needed an entire week to bury the dead. Now, weeks later, the Battle of Fromelles is beginning to unfold on a hazy Wednesday morning, as the British 61st Division and the Australian 5th Division move into their position to launch their attack. Preparations for the battle had begun 4 days earlier, providing a series of signals to the Germans that a larger offensive may be about to occur. For the past 2 days, British artillery fire against German positions has also intensified. General Richard Haking is the British commander on this part of the front. He believes that the objective, the rearmost trench of the enemy's front line, lies about 140 meters beyond no man's land. Haking is based at 11th Corps HQ in Sailly, 187 kilometers away, and is convinced the objective is achievable by a smaller force than previously imagined. He decides that one division from 11th Corps under Major General Colin Mackenzie fight alongside the 5th Australian Division, commanded by Gallipoli veteran Lieutenant General Sir James Mackay. However, the British 61st Division is generally considered to be under-equipped, and it will be the 5th Australian Division's first experience of combat on the Western Front. Brigadier General Harold Pompey Elliott, commander of the Australian 15th Brigade, part of the 5th Division, has great misgivings about the coming attack. Many aspects of the planning and his experience suggest to him that the whole operation is inadvisable. Among other things, the Australian artillerymen, whose role will be crucial to the operation's success, are inexperienced and their guns are unreliable. Adding to these concerns, the distance to be covered across no man's land is highly variable across the line of attack, in some places being up to 400 meters wide. Much of this ground is waterlogged and in clear view of the German positions, including the Sugarloaf salient, a series of concrete bunkers fortified with machine guns able to fire forward and to each side. Elliott has taken a visiting staff officer from Field Marshal Haig's headquarters, Major Howard, beyond the front line to a post in no man's land where there's a good view of the Sugarloaf. After showing Howard the plan of attack, the draft orders, and the ground over which the attack is to take place, Elliott asks for the Major's frank assessment of the likely outcome. Howard predicts a bloody Holocaust. Elliott urges him to go back to Field Marshal Haig and inform him that Haking's strategy is flawed. Whether or not Howard was able to do so remains unclear, but by the morning of the 19th, the only result has been a delay in the operation. German defences on the Aubert Ridge and at Fromelles are substantial and continue to cause immense tactical difficulties for the British and Australians. By July 1916, the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division holds more than 7 kilometres of the German front line. Each of the division's regiments has been allocated a sector, each in turn manned by individual infantry companies. The trenches never run in a completely straight line, but a zigzag to limit the damage from artillery, machine gun fire and bombing attacks. At their strongest, the German trenches are protected by sandbag breastworks over 2 meters high and 6 meters deep, which makes them resistant to all but direct hits by artillery. This line is further protected by thick bands of barbed wire entanglements. There are 2 salients in the German line. One is called the Sugarloaf and the other Wick. Both are heavily fortified and contain machine gunners overlooking no man's land and the Allied lines beyond. Along the German line, there are about 75 solid concrete shelters. From their frontline trenches, the Germans have dug tunnels under the wire and about 30 meters into no man's land, which they use as listening posts. At night, searchlights, flares, and star shells illuminate the front line. A trench tramway network, known as a push line, has been constructed along the entire length of and parallel to the trenches. Other tram lines branch off towards the rear. These supply lines are in some locations connected to tracks for horse-drawn or petrol-driven vehicles, and in turn meet up with the standard gauge French railway network. A buried telephone network and electricity supply is also in place, powering lighting, water pumps, concrete mixing stations, and other amenities. It is by far a more sophisticated and solid defensive system than that occupied by the British and Australians. Aubert Ridge itself provides a good screen for German artillery positions, but is not high enough for effective direct observation of the enemy. As a result, the Germans have constructed platforms in trees, observation posts in church towers and chimneys, and concrete structures within taller farm buildings. Having occupied this part of the line for about 2 years, the Germans also know the terrain intimately, in contrast to the newly arrived Allied units. Pompey Elliott's misgivings about the battle to come are well founded. On the morning of the 19th of July, the British and Australian artillery bombardment of German lines commences at 11 a.m., 7 hours later than planned, due to poor visibility. The artillery has 2 decisive objectives. Firstly, to put enemy machine guns and their crews out of action, or at least keep them from firing until the infantry reach the German trenches. Secondly, to destroy the barbed wire and collapse the German parapet, depriving the German infantry of their defences and preserving the lives of the attacking troops. The Allied artillery averages 1 gun for every 8 meters of German front line, a denser ratio than was available for the first day of the Somme offensive. As the bombardment begins, the quiet landscape is transformed into a deafening, shuddering tumult. Machine Gun Sergeant Les Martin recalled later in a letter to his brother, "From about 11 a.m. till 6 p.m. there was not a space of a second's duration when some of our guns were not firing. The row was deafening. I put wadding in my ears while we were down in the supports waiting to go forward." Half an hour into the bombardment, 5 British aircraft fly over the Wick salient area to observe the effects of the shelling of the German positions, including the front line, the wire entanglements, and the rear areas, including the hamlets of Aubert and Erti. They report many German shelters and dugouts appear buried, and wire defences cut. At midday, the bombardment increases. German commanders send up 2 aircraft to locate the British artillery positions. By 1 p.m., 2 hours after the Allied bombardment began, German artillery is responding. The German 32nd Battalion's commanding officer reports hostile trench mortars and 18-pounders smashing our parapets and trenches to pieces. Many casualties. At about 2:30 p.m, Allied artillery observers report their bombardment on one of the prime targets, the Sugarloaf salient, has been ineffective and the wire entanglements remain uncut. An order is sent to increase the barrage in order to cut the wire, but the message is not received until after 5 p.m, by which time it's too late. It is now 5 p.m, and German artillery is pounding the Allied front line where Australian and British troops prepare for the charge. This artillery is supported by heavy machine guns, unsilenced during 6 hours of bombardment. Later, a 14th Brigade non-commissioned officer recalled, "The first thing that struck you was that the shells were bursting everywhere, mostly high explosive. And you'd see machine guns knocking bits off the trees in front of the reserve line and sparking against the wire. When men looked over the top, they saw no man's land leaping up everywhere in showers of dust and sand, rather confirming our fears that the Germans knew something." The next hour is a perfect demonstration of what is often called the fog of war, as plans and orders are overtaken by the tide of battle. At 5:10, Brigadier General Pompey Elliott receives a warning that the barbed wire surrounding the Sugarloaf in front of his brigade's position has been left uncut by the bombardment. Observers note 3 intact German machine gun emplacements. Adding to Elliott's problems, part of his force is not in position because of the ferocity of the German artillery. 5 minutes later, to the right of the Australians, British soldiers begin to leave doors called sally ports in the trenches and enter no man's land. The effect is very different to a line of soldiers going over the parapet. The small doorways naturally funnel the soldiers, causing congestion and making them an ideal target for German machine gunners who shoot them down as they try to fan out from these narrow exits. The effect is horrific as bodies pile up around the doorways. Elsewhere along the line, British and Australian soldiers begin a series of movements from the rear trenches to the forward line. So congested are the Australian trenches that many of these men need to go out over open ground to reach their starting point. They come under intense artillery and machine gun fire as they do so. The first wave of Australians goes over the parapet into no man's land just after 5:40 p.m. Throughout this first hour of the infantry attack, sheer chaos reigns as men charge, fall, or inch forward across no man's land under the storm of artillery and machine gun fire. By 6 p.m, British and Australian troops have in some sectors reached the German front line and are beginning to break into the trenches as Allied artillery lifts its range to target areas behind the enemy's front.